So hello everyone, and welcome to our final session for day one of the Now Fest. We have a super interesting panel with literal legends in their fields to understand data, deepfakes, fake news, and their future. So on the panel today, we have Patrick Fagan. He is a behavioral scientist, author, lecturer, and practitioner. Previously, he was the lead psychologist at Cambridge Analytica and the co-founder of Capuchin Behavioural Science, a firm which uses this science to yield commercial results for clients. Next, Prince Ghuman, co-author of Blindside, The Mostly Hidden Brain. Prince is a professor at Hult Business School, San Francisco, and the CEO of the Neuromarketing company Pop Neuro. Then we have Hao Li. He is an expert in deepfakes, computer design, and graphics. He was listed as one of the world's top 35 innovators under 35 by the MIT Tech Review in 2013. Dynamic shape reconstruction and non-rigid registration are widely developed in the industry. And finally, last but not the least, our moderator for this session, Dr. Roozenbeek. He's a Baye Fellow in Psychology at Churchill College, and his research focuses mainly on online misinformation, and his background in journalism and media studies is what makes his research unique. His interests range from socio-informatics to content analysis to vaccine hesitancy and violent extremism. So if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to drop them in the LinkedIn comment box or tweet them using the hashtag NowFest. And without further ado, I'm super excited to hear from all of you. So yeah, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Very nice to see everyone here. Many of you will have I'm meeting for the first time, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion. So essentially, what I wanted to do as the moderator here was also to leave a lot of room for audience input. But what I wanted to start with actually was for each of our speakers to introduce themselves and also their views on what we're discussing here today, which is fake news and especially the future of fake news. So in that light, I won't take up too much of your time talking without any kind of substance, really. So let's just jump straight in, and I would like to invite Patrick Fagan to go first and give us a sort of a brief overview of what you've been working on, what you want to talk about, and your insights. And yeah, after that, I will also have a few questions prepared for everyone, some trick questions, some very serious questions, and so on. So welcome and please enjoy.
Great, hi. So I have about 10 minutes, is that right?
10 to 12 to take it.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, great. So hi, I'm Patrick. Sometimes I ask people to call me Pat because research says it makes me more likable. So hopefully that's working. I think I need all the help I can get on that front, seeing as I used to be the lead psychologist at Cambridge Analytica. I also have a foot in academia at a couple of universities and publishing papers, and I wrote a book on comm psychology. And I work generally in kind of political communications and persuading and nudging the public and so on. So today I think there's two things I'd like to briefly talk about. One is, yes, that Cambridge Analytica side of things, digital targeting, what is it, how does it work? But also, you know, working as I do in mass persuasion, I'd like to also talk about the meaning of truth and consensus and maybe some of the caveats of using behavioral science to combat fake news. My thesis being that maybe it's more dangerous to use behavioral science to kind of control what people are allowed to read or say or think, even with the best of intentions, than it is to use it for, say, targeted advertising. So on that point, targeted advertising is possible because of a principle in psychology called thin slices. So if I was to give you a thin slice of cake, you could tell me quite accurately what the whole cake looks like without having to see it. And in the same way, if you see a thin slice of somebody's behavior, you can predict what the rest of their behavior is like. So if you see their bedroom, for example, you can make quite accurate inferences about how organized they are, how creative or outgoing they are. And so you can predict certain behaviors in the future and what kind of messages and things they'll respond to well. So there's bedrooms, also, of course, Facebook profiles are a good thin slice. So one study found that this algorithm, if you give it your Facebook likes, it can actually predict your personality better than can your friends, your families, your colleagues. So it can be quite predictive and accurate. This works because there are these underlying dispositions, personality traits, which can be inferred from behaviors, but once it's inferred, you can then predict behaviors. So let's take extroversion, for example. Extroverts are more reward sensitive. They have more volume in the part of the brain that deals with reward. And as a result, they tend to be more optimistic and more outgoing, and more active, more gregarious. So if you see someone smiles a lot and they talk a lot and they listen to dance music, you can infer that they are an extrovert. But then you can use that inference to predict behavior in the future. So you know that person who smiles a lot will probably do well in a sales role. So there's all sorts of things that you can predict from these kind of cues. So I actually did a study to see recently if you could predict people's kind of secrets from seemingly unrelated things. And so one of the things I found as an example was we could predict whether or not they watched hentai from their media consumption. So do they like foreign films? Do they watch animated TV shows? And do they read science books? Were some of the predictors. But the point being that you can take these seemingly innocuous, unrelated things and predict all sorts about someone's psychology and behavior. Other academic research, for example, has shown that if somebody likes sweet foods more than average, they're more likely to be agreeable. So sweet people like sweet foods. And another study found that agreeable people are more likely to say yes to an orgy. So if you know somebody who really likes sweet foods, you know what they get up to at the weekend now. But the practical application of this is that you can customize messaging to different personality traits. So that extroverted person who smiles a lot, they will like stimulating diverse aesthetics. They will like messaging with people in it. Agreeable people will be more likely to be nudged by social proof, conscientious people by reciprocity, and so on. So you can see how you can target nudges and messaging and tone of voice to different groups of people. The evidence is mixed. By and large, it shows that it works and it's effective, but when it does work, it works very well. But there are still some nuances to kind of iron out. So that's the side of kind of the targeted messaging, and you can see how that could be used for fake news. But I'd also like to kind of tackle psychologically the idea of fake news in general. So I'll tell you a story about myself. It's a little embarrassing, but when I was about 19 or 20, I was a bit of a tearaway. I was in a band, and there was this D-list celebrity in the UK I used to hang out with. And I hung out with her one evening, and then the next day in the gossip pages of The Sun, the newspaper, it said that so-and-so, this girl, was in Club X and doing this embarrassing thing. And I knew that she hadn't been there because I was with her, and I knew that she wouldn't do that thing. So that was my first inkling that maybe sometimes what's in newspapers or on TV, the news TV, is not always true. And it's kind of just got worse since then, especially 2015, 2016. There was a lot of kind of naked media bias in the news. And then working at Cambridge Analytica, I saw all sorts of kind of mistruths and misinformation reported as fact about what the company did and didn't do. So I think fake news is an issue, and it's always been an issue, but it's not just from kind of parody websites or internet trolls. And the kind of simple propaganda techniques of the past are anything but. So targeted advertising does work, but it's nowhere near as effective as having the media or universities or Hollywood repeat a message. So if we think, I just pulled together 3 things that the media have said that turned out to be not true, and they caused a lot of damage. So I mean that there were WMDs in Iraq, or we're still looking, that Osama bin Laden is in Afghanistan, and then more recently that 2.2 million Americans and 500,000 Brits will die from COVID-19. That was a vastly overstated estimate, and we have all these measures which may or may not be correct, but if they're not, that's a huge, there's lots of costs from the lockdown in terms of mental health, the economy, and so on. So the establishment, the traditional media has a big responsibility, I think. So the idea of fake news, I don't think it's a uniquely digital phenomenon. And I think it can sometimes be used as a label, as a kind of political tool to control the narrative. So then that brings us to using behavioral science to nudge against it. Edward Bernays is the kind of grandfather, as it were, of public relations and marketing research, said the only difference between propaganda and education is whether or not we believe in it. And I think there's a key question here of who gets to dictate what is fake news and what isn't. Who gets to decide what the public is allowed to read and say and think. And again, on coronavirus, we have a really potentially dangerous situation at the minute where doctors and scientists have been banned from Facebook, from YouTube, from Twitter, their videos scrubbed for giving their informed opinion against the kind of consensus of the lockdown. And these aren't kooks, these aren't kind of flat earthers, these are just doctors and scientists who disagree. And I think it's potentially dangerous to label them as fake news. And freedom tends to lead to efficiency. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as my pops used to say, until he died of gangrene. That's a joke. But I think you have to, it's really important to have free speech because heretics and gadflies like Socrates are really important for the functioning of society. It's like without mutations, we wouldn't evolve. So you need the kind of the freaks and the geeks to say weird things and wrong things. We need to put ideas out there to see if they're true and see if they stick. So then just a couple more points. So one is on the nature of truth, particularly related to cognitive biases. And one of the prep questions was around flat earthers. I'm not saying the earth is flat, but I'd encourage people to ask themselves, how do they know it's not? I mean, have they been to space and seen it for themselves? Have they conducted experiments with pendulums or whatever it might be to infer that it's round? I would wager in most cases people haven't done those things. They know it's round because A, everyone else says it's round, and B, teachers and scientists say it's round. So under any other context, we'd say that's consensus and authority, which are both cognitive biases, and we'd encourage more of a kind of critical view of this. So I think it's important to be aware of cognitive biases and not to kind of be biased against people who might question or criticize the consensus. So the final thing then, what's the answer, especially as we move towards the age of the deep fake, where how do we know what's real or not? Well, I'd ask, how do we know now? Of course, Orson Welles, when he read out War of the Worlds all those decades ago, people thought that the aliens were actually invading. And so I think psychologically, when you see something on TV or you experience it in kind of the same psychological way, whether it's fact or fiction. And so differentiating truth from fiction has always been an issue, and it probably always will be. So I'd suggest that the issue is not so much fake news, but more an ability of people to think critically in general. To distinguish fact from fiction, we need to enhance critical thinking skills, and maybe the idea of kind of using nudges is kind of fighting fire with fire. Maybe another perspective might be to move away from irrational thinking in general and try and encourage people to be more critical. I believe there's some research that IQ levels are declining, at least across the West. And one of the culprits may be technology. So there's something called the brain drain, where if you have your smartphone out, just out lying on the desk, you're less able to concentrate. It depletes your attention span. There's another study where it talks about the phone as the extended mind, and says the more people use their smartphone, the less rationally they think about things and the more they rely on heuristics. So I think there are certain things like technology which are harming our ability or reducing it to think critically, and that can allow for fake news from any source, traditional or otherwise, to flourish.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Definitely some interesting food for thought for the discussion in a little bit that I would also encourage everyone else to weigh in on. Prince Ghuman, please, the floor is yours.
Right on. Thank you, John. Patrick, I love that you brought up Edward Bernays. A little fun fact, he was the nephew of none other than Siggy Freud. And of course, is the godfather, right, Patrick? He wrote the book on propaganda before propaganda meant what it means now, right?
He also, he is a direct relative of the co-founder and CEO of Netflix, which is interesting.
That's right, that's funny. Yeah, man, making Sigmund Freud proud decades later. Hi, you guys, my name is Prince Ghuman. I'm a professor of neuromarketing, and I'm an author of Blindsight. and I am a coach of ethical neuromarketing practices. And I realize for some of you that might sound like an oxymoron, so let's go ahead and deconstruct that. The main thing I want to underline today for the outline that we have here is what drives me, okay? Before I get to that, I think it's important to think about how some of us got here in the world of behavior science. Some of us knew from day one that they were into psychology, neuroscience, and got their alphabets next to their names and found a way to make money off of it. I came from a tactical perspective. I came from a marketing perspective. I was fortunate enough to be in marketing leadership roles earlier on because I worked for startups for the first half of my career. And what that meant was this untapped resource of neuroscience and psychology abstracts were mine to digest, create tactics for, and test. Literally read over the weekend and test on Monday and see what worked and what didn't work. And that's how I got my 10,000 hours, so to speak, into this field. And I ended up becoming a professor and teaching part of that. And you know, I want to take a moment to underline why I'm here. I'm here because I'm driven to bridge this trust gap between consumers and marketers. And I think, yes, we can get into the specifics with fake news or privacy issues or nudges. And after what point is a nudge simply stepping into our free will? We can talk about all those things. But ultimately, there is a lack of trust between consumers. And we're all consumers, right? We're all consumers, and some of us are creators. We're marketers. We're product people. We are messengers, and as consumers, we love to consume. We have different strengths of consumption, but we love to find products and messages and ideals and philosophies and political parties that we love and defend. And on the other side, we like to create products that people fall in love with. However, we still don't trust a lot of this. And that's where I think I want to start off addressing the deep fake part first, because Hao's right after me. I know he's going to go ham on this, and because he's on the creation side of it, right, Hao?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I'm talking to the guy who's known to make deep fakes. I don't know if you guys have heard of the cocktail party effect. The cocktail party effect is essentially your brain. It's the Alexa version, where Alexa's always listening for her name, Alexa. Your brain is listening for your name. They've been able to test it even in your sleep, definitely when you're awake. When you're at a cocktail party, you hear someone call your name you did not know existed 10 minutes ago, but now you heard your name and you're tuned in, right? And this exists in the visual domain as well, not just auditory, and there's research that backs that up as well. I bring that up because one of the applications I think I found fascinating is using deepfakes for attention in advertising. And it, you know, obviously you have to calibrate the creep factor, right? So if the deepfake looks exactly like me while I'm wearing a watch, then it'll creep me out. But if it looks close enough to me, it'll help the doom scroll, help grab attention during doom scrolling, right? So I do think there's applications for deepfakes there. I do think that with deepfakes come responsibility, Hal, and the ability to create deepfakes, and negatively addressing the possible innovation and application of it. And I think that's what happens a lot. That happened to me when I used the Face app, where I aged myself and my best friends and my parents and my sister, and then I turned them into infants, and someone else owns the rights to that, right? And I think that's sort of the innovation, but the downside, right? The Wild West nature of innovative technology that comes in, and eventually consumers catch up, and way down here is public policy, right? And in the process, we gain and lose a lot of things. And I think that's where I want to introduce my concept that I want to throw out there to everyone else to push back and think about, because I think it addresses some of these issues, whether it's privacy with deep fakes, nudges, data, massive data collection and splicing of personalities and predictable analytics. It's trading value. The point I want to make is, when you're a creator, how, Patrick, how are you creating value for the ultimate consumer? And is it a transparent trade of value, right? And that's a concept that I think needs to be thought about more and more. It's almost too simple to say the definition of marketing is trading value, because I think it's beyond marketing. And I think what has happened is tons of innovation and not a lot of transparency. Consumers understand how they're getting value from Facebook. And yes, we're talking about Facebook because a lot of this propaganda, a lot of the fake news, there are the aggregate, there's the creators and distribution and the distributors and the aggregators. And as consumers, we have a vague idea of the value we get from Facebook. But maybe not the people in this room, but I'm willing to bet our parents and other people who are not in behavior science and data don't know how Facebook is extracting value, right? WhatsApp is an amazing product. It's how we connect to people all over the world as the world is getting flat. But the consumer doesn't question why it's free. And the trade of value is not transparent. And we need to, as leaders in the field, address that trade of value. And typically, historically, it's through consumer education, public policy, and all this stuff catches on over time. It evolves. So, I mean, clearly we've got John also on the panel who's right now asking questions, but he's the one who is studying this academically. So I'd love for you to jump in on this whenever you feel appropriate later on as well, John. But just to go back to that, can we put the trading value frame on how we do things that we do? Because, and this is key, the consumer, whether it's a potential voter or a potential buyer, is evolving, right? The consumer is evolving. They're not going to stay in the dark forever. So nudges, once you know about them, do they lose effectiveness? Are you able to, do you still find that need to not click that BuzzFeed article with the catchy clickbait? I think we are getting slightly immune to certain types of nudges, right? And I think when the consumer evolves, and this is great for Patrick and I to nerd out on too, is we haven't talked about data ownership, right? Because right now data ownership sits in very small people's hands, very small group of people's hands. But what happens when consumers wisen up to it and there's indication this is already happening, right? And what happens when they want to own their own data, or like Airbnb, rent and monetize their own data? That's the future. And I'm partially optimistic and hoping that's the future, but I'm also seeing that that is where this is heading as well. So to answer the other question that's part of the outline is this all good or is this all bad? Well, I think it is, we've let the monkey out the cage, but at the same time, there is possible good because it makes room for new types of business models that with the right entrepreneurs and startup mindset is going to break this sort of a monopoly that Googles and Facebooks of the world have on data, right? And we've already seen, we all use Signal. I'm sure in this group, we all use Signal. Great example, I donate to them and I'm paying for my privacy, right? Some of us may even use the Brave browser. They created their own cryptocurrency and you can choose to make money off of giving up your right to not be advertised to, or you can stay private, right? And those are just early examples. Why is it that I can't rat off 20 more examples? Well, I think it's the beginning of that type of entrepreneurship that addresses these things. So although that is my biggest conceptual drive in this conversation, we can sit and talk about specifics on how to address confirmation bias, availability bias, or how to address nudges and how to address the who gets to call it fake and real and propaganda aspect. I'm happy to open it up to discussion. I just want to use my precious 10 minutes of time to put in this foundation that hopefully you guys and I can work on tweaking it and making it better. So trading value as a creator or a marketer or a messenger and as a consumer is sort of the foundation to bridge in this weird trust gap that we have. And yes, that bleeds into all these things we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prince. Again, a lot of food for thought. Hao, the floor is yours, so please go right ahead.
Yeah, so I think this is great. We're almost already getting into a potential discussion and debate about, are these kind of technologies, these kind of developments good or bad? And I'll get into that on my perspective. Let me first start saying a little bit about myself. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of a startup called Pinscreen. We actually built highly realistic virtual humans, as well as fully autonomous humans that people can interact with. And previously, I was for 7 years a professor at USC. I actually developed a lot of technologies that have led to real-time facial capture, facial processing, and the generation of AI synthesized faces. And so, some of my previous research has led to the Animoji technology and iPhones, etc. I worked on the reenactment of Paul Walker in the movie Furious 7. So there's some interesting projects I've been working on that are related to deepfakes. In some ways, they are, sort of like a first version of a high-end deepfake before even this term actually became popular or wasn't even coined. And we talked a lot about deepfakes, and I'd like to, and also, I think, Prince, you also mentioned some things like what are their values, what are the products, why do we even create them? And I'd like to start off with my perspective and also how my work led to that and how we came here, right? And I think that's probably a good thing to discuss a little bit. So first of all, I already mentioned, like, during my PhD, we back at ETH Zurich, we started to explore, different technologies that can help VFX. So I was working in a field called computer graphics. And in computer graphics, the first thing you'll think about are video games, computer animation, special effects that you see in movies. And back then, there was one big challenge, which is how do we create highly realistic digital humans? And that was sort of like a holy grail for us to reach. And, with a lot of money, you can basically generate really high quality digital humans. But then the problem is that these kind of technologies did not scale. So there were a lot of applications in the film business, for example, stories you couldn't tell, you couldn't bring people that have passed away to life. You couldn't impersonate someone in a very realistic way, in a way that it can be cost effective. So there was a huge effort in the research community in using data-driven techniques, which is instead of doing everything manually with digital artists, you would actually start to use data to see how these kind of technologies would scale. And that's sort of like how, all these work on facial tracking became popular. That's sort of like afterwards you had, all these kind of effects on Snapchat. You have lenses where you can have all these mask effects. These are all results of, research that people have done in our graphics community on how do we make these kind of effects accessible to people. And then so another thing happened that was sort of like around 2014, where a researcher called Ian Goodfellow, he's working now at Apple, invented a technique called generative adversary networks, right? So that allows you to generate basically realistic content from just noise by training deep neural networks with a lot of data. And a lot of these things became possible because you have GPU powers, etc. Now, what happens afterwards is that every year there was huge advancements in this area. And in our company, for instance, we also started to get very early on these kind of capabilities that are suddenly possible with machine learning. So what one of the things that we started to do was to experiment with how do we generate extremely realistic human faces out of a single picture? How can I take a picture of someone and puppeteer that person and generate very realistic facial expressions of him for the purpose of entertainment, creating consumer apps that are solely for, mask, or now we're focusing on generating highly realistic virtual humans for, they can be virtual influencers, they can be virtual assistants. So we're building these core building blocks for these kind of capabilities. And something that happened one day was, I was on a trip to London and I got a call suddenly from one of our investors, and they're like, "Hey, Hao, was this you?" And then I saw this news article, and I was like creeped out. I was like, "Holy crap!" There's like, this news article about how deepfakes, and it's the first time I heard about this term, used for pornography, right? You have some celebrities' faces that are inserted into porn, and it started to, get crazy and become. And my first reaction was, the results are really good, and it's really similar to what we were working on, right? So first of all, we didn't create a deepfakes, but we worked on a lot of things that are extremely related. And maybe one thing that we feel could have been an issue is that we always published our technologies in peer-reviewed conferences, and there's obviously a lot of things that are very similar, right? And when we looked at that, that's when we thought, that's something, and it's not just us. There's maybe 3 or 4 research groups in the world that were working on similar problems. And we saw that suddenly someone has open sourced a code out there to allow people to, download, modify, improve, and basically generate anything they wanted. And the results are very good. And we started to look into that, and we said, we talked to them, and we said basically, we talked to people in our community, and we had to do something about this, right? So at our conferences, we started to organize workshops. We started to discuss, ethical concerns about that, what kind of problems there could be. And one thing that is very important is how fast is this whole thing developing, and what things aren't we prepared for, right? How do we protect against these kind of things? And that's sort of the time when, people started thinking about, well, maybe we need to do research specifically on how do we protect ourselves against deepfakes, and what are the steps, right? So on a technology standpoint, the first thing is, can we really detect those things? If you see a content, can you see if something is fake or not? And there was a DARPA effort actually before deepfakes called Metaphor, Media Forensics. It's a big program where they worked on, they basically work with universities to develop technologies to do forensics. Like, can we see if something was manipulated or not? But the thing that, people weren't really prepared for is that using these new deep learning capabilities, you can generate content that are nearly indistinguishable from real ones. So, we started to work on different things. We started work to collaborate with UC Berkeley on how do we detect deepfakes, assuming they were perfect. We had a project with the World Economic Forum where we wanted to showcase how fast deepfakes really develop. So we developed a real-time deepfake that generated really, really convincing results. But we wanted to show it to world leaders so that there's a discussion about what are things we have to be prepared for, right? And because everything so far, everyone would believe in videos, right? So videos are something that only high-end VFX companies would have the capability to manipulate. But what if anyone can generate content? And the main issue that we see and we already, Patrick and Prince, you already talked about it, is on social media. There is the main problem is that you can't control what people are uploading, what is being shared. Well, it's not true that you can't control. I mean, they are controlling it, and they might be. I mean, the social media platforms are controlling, and they might be controlling not in the way where the truth is being revealed, right? It could be the focus can be not on the truth, and it's mostly not on the truth. So the problem that social media is a catalyzer for fake news and fake information also means that the threat for traditional media content that we would trust can be, and even psychologically, I've seen that video. I know it has happened. I know this person has said that. Can really be a huge problem for what we perceive as what is real and what isn't. Now, one may say that well, they have deepfake detectors. They're working on that. They are censoring content, they are flagging content, right? So these are things that some social media platforms are doing, but the question is whether this is effective or not. Are deepfakes really a threat? Because so far they have been used, they have been a problem in, you know, pornography, but in politics, indirectly, right? So nobody has really, well, we don't know, but not to my knowledge, I haven't seen one where they have actually put something in the mouth of someone for a specific, or one that has been very effective. And, you know, a lot of that could be attributed to the fact that maybe the deepfakes right now are still more tedious to produce right now to get something that's good. But we shouldn't assume that's always going to be the case. Another threat is, and you also mentioned about WhatsApp, what if people started, you know, communicate, well, on certain, you know, communication platforms, direct messaging platforms like Line or WeChat, people basically share information just by sending direct messages. So that is one area where there is simply no censorship, right? So you can send anything you want. And that could be one potential danger, because many people, that's how they actually consume news nowadays. And right, so basically, I think some things we could discuss is, you know, how do we protect ourselves against, you know, these kind of more sophisticated, you know, forms of disinformation? How can we, and are they, you know, are there other things, you know, are there also positive applications of that, right? So we're actually involved in a new effort from DARPA. So it's called Semaphore, Semantic Forensics. So that's the, you know, because you have all these new threats, they're looking at how do we analyze and how do we not just detect deepfakes, but how can we know if a deepfake is good or bad? Because if I'm just making a comedy, or it might be harmless and there's nothing really bad about it. But what if the intention, is there a way that we can actually know what the intention is? Is there a way that we can know where the source comes from? Those deeper kind of analysis are very important. And the idea is really just to assume that, you know, whatever you see can be so good that you really can't tell the difference anymore. And we have already shown examples of that where this is already possible. So yeah, so we can maybe open up to discussions.
Thank you very much. If I can ask the organizers, we have until about 7 o'clock UK time. Is that still correct? And just so I can plan out the sort of the discussion a little bit.
I'm in Los Angeles.
You're in Los Angeles. Well, it's well, I mean 40-ish minutes.
Right.
Approximately.
I have 30 minutes, but that's, yeah.
Okay, that's good. So, okay, I'd like to also leave some room for audience questions if we have any. But the first thing I wanted to open up with, I've heard a lot of very interesting
That's
things.
correct. We have another.
Just so I can plan out the sort of the discussion.
We have around 30-35 minutes more.
Great. Okay, so let's do about 10, maybe 15 minutes, depending on how interesting it all is, just between the four of us, and then move to audience questions, if that's okay. Yeah, first question. Why don't we just get rid of social media? Does more harm than good. Just out. Don't need it. Curious as to your thoughts.
I'll take a first crack at that. I love that question. I think the answer to bad marketing isn't no marketing, and I would like to apply that to social media as well. I would like to say, you know, the answer to bad privacy in social media isn't no social media. It's what we talked about earlier. It's an opportunity for entrepreneurs to come up with social media that isn't that.
Counterpoint. That's from the supply side, but from the demand side, like for the average consumer, is like I, for example, am an average consumer. I'm not helped by having Facebook, and therefore I don't have Facebook anymore. I do technically, but I don't log in, and I'm much happier for it.
But I don't know if I buy that assumption. I don't know if I buy that Facebook is all net negative. right? Because I mean, we can put qualitative value on being able to see your friends have kids and kids photos and see them grow, and you don't have to see them. It's the old Dunbar number of how many friends you can truly have, how many relationships you can truly have, and social media stretches that from friends and also acquaintances that you didn't really count before and complete strangers. So I think there is value in that, but I still think that we are early in and you said it best, it's the supplier side, and we're so early in figuring out the modeling there. So no, I just wanted to point that out as well. It's like there is inherent value consumers who are Facebook users get out of it too. What do you think, Patrick? Sure. Patrick's over here splicing up personality types.
Well, actually, yeah, I don't have much to say actually, because I agree with you, John. So me personally, I'm on a digital detox. Don't even have my smartphone. I've deleted Facebook, deleted the account and the app. And like you, I'm actually much happier for it. I mean, obviously, if people enjoy it and they get value out of it, then more power to them. But for me, I mean, it makes me feel kind of impulsive, unhappy, distracted. And the information that I can get on there, this probably says more about me than your average consumer, but I'm much happier reading a book than looking at the social media feeds.
Yeah, I think in general, my view on technology is that it's always a double-edged sword. And I think we also had this question before, right? Are these things good or bad? I think they're neither good or bad in general, but it could be that a specific form of social media, in this case, can be bad. And I wouldn't say social media in general should be something that is banned. And I think, Patrick and Fagan raised like really good points that, there's also a very good side of it. And I mean, I use social media very frequently. I also read a book from Jaron Lanier that says you have to quit social media right now. And when you read everything that's in there, that's really interesting about how it's collecting your data. But in some ways, I kind of see two types of people. Some people really have an addiction and really lives on it. And I think, and maybe it depends on the generation, from which generation you come from. I don't know. But I also have a group of friends that aren't addicted, right? They're just like, oh yeah, I just saw this post and then whatever. And they don't seem to be so, I think it depends on the person. And I think I see this in many things, right? For video game, some people play a bit of video game. I play video games sometimes, and I don't think that I'm really addicted. I'm just like, I'm really stressed and play a little bit and that's it, right? But some people get really addicted. I think there could be an improved social media. It's just like before people had television, people had smartphones, and then now you have social media platforms that, at scale can, I think maybe one thing that is a bit different now is that these kind of platforms are algorithmically trying to get you more and more addicted, right? And that might be something that's very different than, because you have this feedback loop that you didn't have. Right now, it has the ability to monitor what you're looking at. And before with television, it doesn't really have that capability. So, but the way I see that is that I think it's an evolution process, and probably we're really only at the beginning, and we see all these issues, and it's good that we see these issues. And perhaps there's a better way that will come later, in a different form. Snapchat is actually a good example of a different kind of social media where information, for example, isn't just there all the time, right? So things can disappear. So the privacy issue that we've discussed before, could be one thing that could be solved, but then this addiction is, another thing.
And if I could add to that, Hao, I do believe in consumer power. It sounds cheesy, but I genuinely believe in consumer power. I think, Hao, I'm sure you're familiar with it. I'm going to speak for the US people in the audience too, is we didn't have organic food everywhere when we were kids. It wasn't a thing, right? It became a thing because there wasn't there's a tiny bit of unmet demand, and all this data came about how food is actually made. And then consumers decided to not only ask for organic food, but pay a premium for it. And I think that little analogy fits social media as well. And I think we're at the cusp of that level of education where consumers do that. And we've seen this before, and you're right there, John, and Hao, I think you guys made this point indirectly, is before this, kids were addicted to TV. And then before that, it was rock and roll music. And at some point after all those things, it was video games, right? The first Nintendo. And we did eventually find a balance, but you don't have likes, comments, and shares and all this input that you used to with TV. So it is scaling faster to drive behavior than previous technologies. But similarly, consumers are wisening up to it, maybe not at the pace which we would want them to. And I think there's value there. Patrick, I envy you. But if it wasn't for my book, I would delete all of my social networks. But because now I have and I know you've got a book coming out too, right? Hooked. So if it wasn't for that, I did delete all my social networks. So I'm with you.
I think it's just easier for me because I don't have many friends.
I see. Well, yeah, it's an interesting discussion, but I kind of want to circle back to the issue of fake news more specifically. So I have a couple of questions for everyone, which we might not have time for, but that's fine. Prince, like, would you say like successful fake news mongerers, let's say, are just good marketers, as in they're doing exactly the same thing, except they're selling something else?
I would, and we can go darker too. You know, it's fake news, but you look at the old ISIS accounts on Twitter, and you can see that they're shot-by-shot recreations of film. They use BTS, behind the scenes, not the K-pop band. Sorry to disappoint any K-pop fans in the audience. But they use behind the scenes to make it feel more visceral and real, and they use very well choreographed hero videos. And they also, you know, show selfies of the soldiers with, you know, I don't know, a copy of Jumanji or something. They humanize the stuff behind it. So, yeah, they're using the exact same tactics, John. I agree.
Mm-hmm. So then, like, that kind of circles back into the next problem, which I think Patrick essentially pointed out mostly at the beginning, like who gets to decide what is harmful and what is not. And the thing I wanted to say about that is, I think it's not that controversial to say that the fundamental distinction that we should be worrying about is between fake and real, but rather between harmful and not harmful. Right, because satire is fake. There was an amazing story about Kim Jong-un becoming sexiest man alive, you know, according to The Onion 8 years ago. And some Chinese propaganda paper picked that up and thought it was serious and added the whole slideshow of Kim Jong-un sitting on a horse. I thought that was awesome because it's like if some Chinese propaganda rag embarrasses itself because of a joke, then I don't see any problem with that, right? But it's still fake news, right? And then what I might also do is, if I would be the producer of fake news, and let's say there was an algorithm or a moderator or whatever that would infallibly pick up on the fact that I'm posting fake news, I would simply change my tactics to not technically be lying, but still achieve the same goals, right? For example, I might deliberately, let's say, impersonate the supporter of a particular political movement, post something very extreme online, and make it look like that whole movement holds these very extreme opinions, right? It's just super simple stuff. We don't need advanced technology to do that, just basic insights into pressure points in a given society. So that means you're left with a bit of a problem, right? There's no universal standard for what is harmful and what is not. There is definitely the will on part of, let's say, major social media companies to address this issue, because obviously I don't think anyone really disagrees that Twitter is deleting, like, I don't know, like an actual Nazi's tweets, right? Who says like complete Nazi stuff. And Twitter would, I think, be right to say, well, we don't want that on our platform. So far, no controversies yet, but obviously the thing that everyone is discussing at the moment is, how do these moderation policies work? And what, if there is any line whatsoever, where should we draw it? And also, what is the role, that makes it even more complicated, of private companies in this respect? Because Twitter is a private company, after all, can do what it wants, much. And where if anywhere, should governments start to say something like, well, this is actually illegal, beyond, of course, what is already illegal, things like slander and so on. I was wondering, especially Patrick, if you could weigh in on this, but everyone else, of course. 5 minutes, maybe. It's a big question.
I don't know. So I like to think that, there are two things that never stay hidden, the sun and the truth. And if you kind of let information flow and you have freedom of information, then life finds a way, like Jurassic Park, and the truth comes to the surface and everything evolves and works out for the best. So if you have people who are saying, hateful or untrue things, then if they say that, then ideally the crowd will kind of process that and analyze it and show that it's not true and ridicule it. And in the end, the truth will come from that wisdom of crowds. So just if you let anyone say anything, then the truth eventually bubbles to the top. I mean, that's what I'd like to think. Whether that's actually true or not, I don't know. I mean, if you look at unmoderated forums, 4chan, for example, that's probably, not the best evidence that that's true. So I don't know really, but it does make me nervous to say that the state should be deciding, or that Silicon Valley should be deciding, or that any kind of very small group of people should be deciding what information is allowed to be shared and read and said. So I mean, very, very like crude example. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I'm not advocating terrorism, but I'm just saying there's a big thing of perspective and how things change over time. Of course, Nelson Mandela was in prison for terrorism, and so I think there's a danger if you have a single kind of governing body deciding what truth or harmful narrative is, because of course that changes. So even if it's not this complete freedom of information, I think it does need to have some kind of accountability to the people, and for people to be involved in some way.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, very briefly commenting. Yeah, very interesting point. But like the thing is with the truth sort of bubbling to the top, if you wait long enough, assuming that there is like one, let's say, community on social media, that I think that's pretty reasonable. But unfortunately, we're dealing with filter bubbles that clash into each other, right? Which regurgitate all sorts of information, which isn't necessarily beholden to any kind of truth. It's more like a sort of a political, let's say, bubble that circles your information around. And in those bubbles, it's not likely that any discussion on the inside is likely to approach anything that we might consider to be true according to any kind of reasonable standard. Anyway, that's an aside. It's a whole other discussion. So Hao, please continue.
So I see a few problems here. So first of all, when we communicate with each other, we, by definition, are trying to influence something about the other person. So there's just nothing we can't do about this, because if I don't want to influence you, just don't talk to me. Don't look at me. So by definition, we would do something. And you're right, there's a gray area that is hard to define between what's good and what's bad, and what the intention is. Maybe it's still not bad, but indirectly can have bad consequences, which we don't know. And then what is that bad consequences? So I see two kind of approaches here. I think the main thing is, how can we define a framework that wouldn't cause us to think or would harm something very badly? And then the question is, what is harming badly? So we have the good thing is we can look at it algorithmically, which is we have already seen for the last 10 years so many instances. There's so much data about where something could cause a riot, something could cause people to die simply just because of disinformation. And in the very beginning, I think Patrick mentioned that people should be better informed, or Prince mentioned, I forgot. People should be better need better critical thinking. And I think this better critical thinking, you can either just, educate people and blah, blah, blah. But maybe one thing that can be very effective is if you build this into the social media platform or wherever you consume information. So imagine, right now it's like this. I go to Facebook, I go to Twitter, and whatever I read it just says what I read. It does have the comments of people, but then the problem is that the comments are, for controversial topics, they're very split, extremely divided. But and probably someone else would see different types of comments, or the priorities are different, right? And so I think one thing that could be useful is, what if, and it has to be, I think algorithmically, and it's because it's a skill problem. What if we have the ability to provide always a different information to what we see for something that can be controversial? So let me give you an example. Let's say I see this news about this Chinese virologist that says, the virus was released in the lab. To be honest, I haven't seen any evidence so far that it's wrong what she says, although I don't know what I should believe, because there's some relationship between her and Steve Bannon, so I don't know. But on the other hand, you have other researchers who strongly say it's really wrong what she says, but the evidence, they aren't necessarily providing evidence. So I think it would be good if if the platform would even provide a counter side of thing to actually let the user think. Like it says, these people say this, these people say this. It's up to you to make up the decision, what you think. And I think maybe a better future where we wouldn't have this issue is not just to let other people be in the loop, but have yourself in the loop and yourself have the ability to make up a decision, what you think should be right.
Here's an interesting point. Sorry for interrupting, Prince. 5 more minutes, if that's okay, before we move to audience questions. This is a super interesting point, because that essentially what you're saying, Hao, is it would be a nice idea for social media companies to act basically as editors, much like editors of newspapers and TV channels do, right? Meaning they editorialize the content, they provide context, et cetera, rather than allowing the consumer to basically produce the content and share it in the way that they see fit. That leads to the following point, which I think Prince might be able to weigh in on. Won't that just mean that if the biggest platforms start doing that, new platforms will pop up that meet this demand for what is basically a high fructose, high carbohydrate diet of information, namely the stuff that we know is kind of bad for you, but you want it because your body just craves, right? In this case, your brain. Meaning Facebook is going to go bankrupt because it loses its user base. It already is, but even more. In exchange, and loses this user base to platforms that do not moderate or editorialize, because that's simply what we want.
Yeah, I think to go back to our buddy Eddie Bernays, and his original definition of propaganda was creating a relationship between the public and an idea or a product or a corporation or a message, right? That's where public relations comes from. And I think in order to have that at scale, you need a product like Facebook. It's already scaled, as opposed to, I'm just going to use that as an example, as a product that doesn't scale at the same level. But the other thing is, the shortest answer to this, and this was Mark Zuckerberg's answer to 80% of the questions that were posed to him at the Senate, AI. But what he didn't talk about was, in order to get there, we have to do things that don't scale, so that way one day fighting fake news will scale, right? Right now, AI cannot scale to that. And this is where John's point was, are we smart by letting the tech companies themselves dictate how to regulate themselves? Hell no. And this isn't new conceptually. We did this with finance. We did this with international payments. We did this with trade, right? It's just that our regulators are educated on trade and banking and international payments, and they're not educated on tech yet. So this also, I think, taps a little bit into what Patrick said. Truth comes to the top. Well, maybe it's not truth, or if you would allow me to retranslate that, it's education and understanding, and then regulation. So I think we're headed towards tech regulation, and I'm 100% skeptical of tech companies regulating themselves. Why would you do that? And I think one of the things that we usually forget are the assumptions. What does it take to make a Facebook account, or insert name here for social media account? An email. That's it. Why are we not challenging that with a photo of your ID and you take a selfie and add these little bits in there? Because you need to do stuff like that in order to, if I want to pay Patrick $100 for a bet that I lost and he's in UK and I'm in California, guess what? I have to go through an app that has specific questions that the state has outlined for very healthy reasons to protect the public in order for me to do so. We just need to get there. And in the process, we can't just assume AI is going to catch all these things now. But having Facebook and those companies moderate it themselves, they're going to go for whatever scales early on. They're not going to hire 50,000 humans to overlook and actually be able to say yes or no. They'd rather hire 1,000 data scientists to try to code their way out of that problem. We're not there yet. In order to get to that part, how do you scale for addressing fake news? I think you have to do stuff that doesn't scale. And I think that's where the state comes in and forces these tech companies to take that on.
Thank you very much. I think this was very interesting. To the organizers, is it okay if we now move to audience questions, and how would we come about them?
Do that.
Right. John,
Are they posted in the chat, or?
I'm just going to send you a Word doc over the chat box, and you have like all the questions out to choose from. Give me 2 minutes.
Okay, well, in that case, if we have 2 minutes, we have 2 more minutes to talk. So if anyone wanted to finish a point that they were making, please do.
Well, John, I'm curious about what your thoughts are on this. I mean, you're doing an awesome job getting us to talk. Help me understand with all the work that you've done, you know?
Oh, I'm a scientist. I have no opinions whatsoever. I just follow the numbers.
Yeah. What are the numbers saying?
Yeah.
What are the numbers saying?
So no, I mean, my work is on basically psychological resilience against manipulation. So essentially, like we've been talking about things like scale, right? The question I'm trying to solve is, okay, to what extent can people learn how to spot what a manipulation tactic looks like? Not necessarily an individual persuasion attempt, but rather in general, sort of the latent structure of deception. And if so, how would you do that and make it so that it scales to a reasonable extent? And our current solution is video games. So we created a few sort of very simple, well, very, very simple, but games basically that people can play for free, in which they play a fake news creator. And the nice thing about that is, 1 second, I have to save this. The nice thing about that is it's a lot more fun than some ivory tower jerk from the University of Cambridge telling everyone how they should be consuming information. Rather, it's much more about, create your own fake news, see what you learn from it, that kind of thing. But obviously in an environment where that doesn't cause harm. So that's sort of been our approach, and that's fairly successful in terms of, like, well, whichever method we throw at it, we see pretty much the same results in terms of latent sort of misinformation techniques. But obviously there's a million caveats to that. Not everyone plays games, for example. Also, how long does that effect last, and so on and so on. Either way, we now have this document full of questions.
Right on.
So John, I have to leave at 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you're okay, there's one which maybe I can talk a little bit about the deepfake one. And if that's okay for Patrick and Prince.
Of course, go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so there's a question from Anil about deepfakes, fake news. How far behind is the technology that can detect a fake video or a fake news? I'm emphasizing on fake news, very different from a biased tweet. Okay, so it's good. The question actually distinguishes between deepfakes and fake news. Fake news is a more general term that can encompass audio sources, or it can encompass an article that has fake information. So first of all, a quick answer to that: the technology is always behind, and I think it will get further behind. I think it will come to a point where you can create something where you can't tell the difference. But then the question is, you can't, and for deepfakes, for instance, it's already the case where I mean, maybe there's still some ways you can, but there are ways you can detect basically videos that are nearly perfect, and videos where all existing deepfake detectors would actually fail. And so that's already possible if you put some efforts in it. If you think about an article, that's a harder problem, because you need to write something that is very, very convincing. But you have examples of a company called OpenAI that has created something called GPT-3. So it's a deep neural network that has the ability to generate text that is trained from a lot of data, and it can generate very plausible things. If it's a short content, then there's no way you can tell that something is fake. It's like a very plausible content. Just like deepfakes, if you just lower the resolution, how can you? There's nothing to analyze. So the question is more ultimately, is this content plausible, and is this content harmful, right? And I think we already touched on that before. And I think just being able to detect if something is real or not is going to be a losing battle. But the question of whether it's harmful or not and what the provenance is sort of like what we have to look into. And that's something that will make things a lot easier. Another thing that I can mention is maybe we don't, a lot of people are focused on, what if the deepfakes is perfect? What if, I don't think the main issue is perfect deepfakes. Even if the deepfake is not perfect, even if the problem is if anyone can create it, because people do believe something, even if they know it's wrong. So that is the crazy thing about it. And, there's a company from Alphabet that is, the company above Google called Jigsaw. So they have done some interesting user studies where they tell people this is not real news, but somehow people still believe in it, right? Which is, I think, really a psychological problem that needs to be addressed. And maybe Patrick can say more about that.
Yeah, I'm currently reading The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. It's kind of a classic. And I'm just reading the bit where he says that it's all about affirmation. So just saying the statement is enough, particularly the more often you say it. It doesn't really matter if it's true or if it's scientific. I mean, if it sounds sciencey, it's better, but it's more about just stating things are true, and eventually it gets picked up through mere exposure effect. The more times you hear it, the more kind of believable and familiar it is. So yeah.
How do you protect
there's also the social identity theory, right? Facts don't change my opinion on things that are my identity, right? So you can tell me wearing a mask is good for you, but if you've very efficiently used propaganda to correlate my identity as a Republican, as someone who puts on a mask, then facts be damned. You're attacking. So address the identity in these messaging, right? So address the fact that, are you the kind of person who will stand for truth? And here's the scientific truth. You at least have a fighting chance there when you address the identity. And that's one of the many different ways you can address it, but I'm glad that you brought that up. There's another question in here. Sorry, go ahead, John. No, go down the list.
Please.
There's a couple questions. Okay, there's a couple questions that are related, so I'm going to do my best to tag them together. And Hao, if you have to bounce, it was nice to meet you, man. Next time I'm in LA, I'll ping you for sure. If you're ever in the Bay Area, do the same.
Come visit me, and then let's stay in touch. And I might ping you guys for some questions afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, and then we'll drunk dial Patrick. Bye, Hao.
Thanks everyone for hosting. It was good seeing everyone. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I love this question, which was, why pay for privacy when it's supposed to be a basic right? Awesome question. Here's the thing. We're not just addicted to products. We're addicted to free. We're addicted to free. So yes, that's where the transparent trade isn't clear, right? You can't, I mean, you have to pay for your privacy or pay for the product. But unfortunately, 15 years of business modeling has made it so that we don't care about privacy until 2020, apparently. And so you got stuff for free. So I'm not trying to argue. I just want to point that out, that a lot of this is caused by our own desire to not pay for anything on the internet. We didn't bat an eye when, you know, $1 per minute cell phone calls from India to the US changed to free on Skype. We didn't bat an eye, right? But now we're batting all sorts of eyes. And that's the point. It's full circle coming back to that. So just like cable TV has been broken up into multiple streams you pay for individually, I think if you actually want to get your privacy back, hopefully there's enough entrepreneurs that actually hear this as an unmet need to create products that are private, or Facebook gives up the fat chunk of revenue they're sitting on by selling our attention and privacy to other people and giving the option of paid. So that just, it goes back to our addiction to free. I love the algorithm question. Yes, the algorithm are not optimized for truth. The algorithm is optimized for engagement. And more we agree with something, the more we engage, or there's some differences there. And yes, algorithms are part of the problem. I agree with you. What I did when I reopened my Twitter was follow a bunch of respected Twitter accounts that I consider to be true that disagreed with me. So until they change the algorithm to not just be optimizing for engagement, I followed people that I disagree with on purpose, so that way I can not have a echo chamber in my algorithm if I have to touch an algorithm in social media. It's not a perfect solution, but I'm with you with that, with the algorithm. You can't make it go public because that's their secret sauce, right? Google's, if you've ever done SEO, if there's any search engine optimizers in this room, you know how freaking hard it is to reverse engineer Google's algorithm. But that's the algorithm that is the best search algorithm in the web. They indexed the web and came up with an algorithm to give you results. They're not going to give that away. That's their billion-dollar sauce. So yeah, I don't have an answer outside of follow people you disagree with and be, you know, open to differing opinions.
Yeah.
Got 3 minutes left. So I don't know if that is, if
there's
if there's a question you want to pick out, Patrick, go for it.
Yeah, so the one from Emma, interested to know how Patrick sees how we can teach critical thinking across all walks of life. So I think it's more about reducing cognitive load and reducing kind of emotional priming. So people are very kind of blown around by the winds of emotion at the minute on social media and the news cycle and television and things like that, which really, yeah, prime people to be less, to use less kind of their executive function and be more emotionally driven in their decision making. And if you can reduce decision fatigue, so for example, Steve Jobs would wear the same outfit every day, so he didn't have to think about what he'd wear. Yeah, it's an extreme example, but the more we can free up our limited brain power for making important decisions, like critically analyzing the news and information in general, the better. And then junk food, alcohol, drugs as well also have very similar effects. So the better your diet, the better you can, the more clearly you can think. And then I think the moving image, I think there may be an argument to make there because it doesn't really give you room to breathe intellectually. It's very fast paced. It's much more emotionally engaging and persuasive. So the more you can read, the better. And then related to that as well, and this one's a bit kooky, but I think it's interesting, is the kind of framework that you absorb from popular culture about the world. So I think, you know, if children are watching Cardi B and singing those kind of lyrics, what kind of mindset is that priming? And an interesting one as well is the Disney film Inside Out, where this young girl is controlled by the Ekman emotions in her brain. There's anger, joy, and fear, and so on. The really interesting twist there is that there's no character for logic or reason. So it's kind of this implicit message that she's governed by emotion. So I think, yeah, there are various things which can free up your cognitive mind to make better analyses and decisions. and certain things you can do to take out emotional stimulation in your life, and that should enable critical thinking.
Okay, that is 7 o'clock, my time anyway, probably not everyone else's time. I want to thank everyone for participating. Well, Hao is no longer here, but Patrick and Prince, thank you very much for this fruitful discussion. I really enjoyed it. If anyone has any questions, my email is on the web somewhere, I'm sure. I'm also pretty sure that some Russians or whatever already hacked into it, so send me whatever you want. I don't really care if my data's gone anyway. It is what it is. So, yeah, thank you everyone for your participation, and have a great rest of your day/evening.
Cool. Thank you, John. And thank you guys, 1001 Stories, for putting this together, especially in the short time that you did. You guys don't get enough credit because Patrick and I don't get to see all the sleepless nights. So thank you guys for making this happen. Easier said than done. So pop some bubbles or whatever you desire. Patrick, pleasure to meet you. You guys, everyone take care and keep the conversation going. Yeah. Take care, you guys.
Each and every one of those sleepless nights, absolutely worth it. This was a brilliant discussion.
The amount of
thank you guys.
You've got for you, Prince, Pat, for you, for Hao and John. People have been saying, I think you guys need to get them together regularly every quarter, because this is absolute fireworks.
Seriously, this is an absolutely fantastic panel. There was a point where we literally felt like we just wanted to trap you all in a room and just keep talking.
So thank you for that. This has been one of the most illuminating discussion that we got to hear. We are really lucky to see great minds like you come down and create firework. And for all the audiences who have logged in from all over the world, thank you so much. We'll see you all tomorrow. Same time we start tomorrow. I think tomorrow morning we start with BG Dominic, then we have Jess Groom. But then, we're going to talk about many more things at some point of time. Like I told you guys, we are going to talk about hip hop music too. And then we're going to talk about Bruce Lee, and we're going to find out what Bruce Lee and Jeet Kune Do has got to do with behavioral sciences. So spread the word, and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time. Thank you so much, Pat.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you always. Prince, we're going to see you soon in the book club. John, we're going to talk again.
Thank you, guys.
I think we'll try to find a way to get you guys together. People have asked for it.
We have to.
Thank you all.
All good.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
Good evening.
Have a good night and good morning. Take care, you guys. Bye, Patrick. Bye, John.